somewhere in a reinforced command bunker beneath the city of Dnipro, a city that absorbed over 34 strike locations in a single night just days ago, a Ukrainian targeting officer stares at a laptop screen showing thermal footage. The image is of a wide facility, surrounded by tree lines, deep inside Russian-occupied Donetsk Oblast. He taps his earpiece twice. The coordinates are confirmed. And then, somewhere overhead, a Ukrainian drone, one of dozens simultaneously airborne right now, adjusts its flight path by exactly 2.3 degrees. You're about to find out what happens next. But first, there's something else happening at this exact moment. Something nobody in the Western press is talking about. There's a third player, not Russia, not Ukraine, quietly sitting in a room right now, who has the power to either stop this war or make it infinitely worse. Keep that in your mind. We're coming back to it. Because the story today isn't just about explosions in occupied territory. It's about a chess game being played at 30,000 feet. Diplomatically, militarily, and economically. And the board is shifting faster than at any point in the last 2 years. Let's start with what we know for certain. As of this morning, May 21st, 2026, Ukrainian forces have confirmed multiple simultaneous strikes on Russian military infrastructure across the occupied territories of Donetsk and Zaporizhia oblasts. This isn't speculative. The Ukrainian General Staff issued statements. Telegram channels with direct military sourcing lit up before dawn. The targets hit include an ammunition depot near Kalmykivka, a fuel storage facility near Smolyaninoye, a command post in Sosnivka in Luhansk Oblast, and, this is the one that sent shockwaves through Russian military logistics channels overnight, a drone control center near Yasny in Donetsk Oblast. That last one matters more than almost anything else on that list. That drone control center was not just a building. It was a nerve center for an entire swath of Russian aerial operations over the southeastern front. Signal number 1. Ukraine did not hit these targets randomly. Every single one of those sites sits in what military planners call the medium-range strike corridor, approximately 20 to 120 kilometers from the active front line. And since at least March of this year, Ukraine has been systematically, almost surgically, dismantling every Russian logistics node, every command hub, every fuel depot in that corridor. The Institute for the Study of War assessed in March that this campaign was specifically designed to derail Russia's planned spring-summer 2026 offensive. That offensive, the one Putin's generals have been assembling for months, depends entirely on the kind of sustained supply chain that these strikes are now shredding, piece by piece. Here's a number that should stop you cold. In April alone, Ukraine conducted at least 21 confirmed strikes on Russian oil refineries, export terminals, ships, and pipeline pumping stations. 21 in 1 month. Bloomberg's analysts reported that those strikes pushed Russian refinery runs to their lowest level in over 16 years. Oil industry sources told Reuters that Russia was forced to cut oil production by between 300,000 and 400,000 barrels per day in April, the single sharpest monthly drop in roughly 6 years. You want to understand why Putin is increasingly willing to at least pretend to sit at a negotiating table? That number is the reason. Every 100,000 barrels of daily production Russia loses is approximately $3.5 billion in annual revenue. Do the math. And yet, at this exact moment, a war is still raging. The missiles are still flying. The drones are still being launched by the hundreds. On the night of May 17th to 18th alone, Russia launched 546 drones and missiles, 14 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, 8 Iskander-K cruise missiles, and over 500 Shahed-type and Gerbera-type drones. 546 weapons in a single night. The primary targets? Dnipro City, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, civilians, infrastructure. The Ukrainian Air Force managed to intercept 503 of those drones and 4 of the cruise missiles. That still left 18 missiles and 16 drones that hit 34 locations. 34 locations in one night. People died. Buildings collapsed. And then, the next morning, diplomats in Washington and Kiev were asked about the peace process, as if those 34 burning locations didn't exist. But here's the catch, and this is the first big pivot you need to understand this morning. 12 days ago, something happened that no one fully believed was possible. On May 9th, 2026, a 3-day ceasefire went into effect between Russia and Ukraine, brokered, announced, and muscled into existence by Donald Trump. Both Zelensky and Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, confirmed the arrangement. Trump posted it directly, writing he hoped it would be the beginning of the end of a very long, deadly, and hard-fought war. It lasted 3 days, and then both sides immediately went back to shooting at each other with everything they had. But the fact that it happened at all, that a ceasefire, even a fragile temporary one, actually held for 72 hours, that is the most strategically significant data point of 2026. Because it tells you something that hardliners on both sides desperately don't want you to know. A deal is physically possible. Now let's talk about the room. Because what's happening diplomatically right now is extraordinary, and it is inseparable from the military strikes you woke up to this morning. Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, a real estate developer from New York with no prior diplomatic experience and, according to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, no regional expertise, has nonetheless become the single most consequential individual in the Russia-Ukraine negotiation process. He has flown to Moscow. He has sat across from Putin for 5-hour sessions. He has shuttled to Kyiv. He has met with Zelensky's team in Florida for days at a stretch, alongside Jared Kushner and White House senior advisor Josh Gruenbaum. 35 nations under the Coalition of the Willing have signed on to a framework that includes, quote, durable security guarantees and robust prosperity commitments for Ukraine. In January, Witkoff told reporters negotiations were down to one issue. One issue. The secret offer, and this is what officials are describing privately to reporters, even if they won't say it on the record, is essentially a frozen conflict framework. Ukraine keeps the territory it physically controls right now. Russia keeps what it has seized. Neither side formally recognizes the other's claims. A ceasefire monitoring mechanism is established. Western military assistance to Ukraine continues, but at reduced levels. Security guarantees for Kyiv are written into a framework that stops short of NATO membership, but gestures toward it. And in exchange, some of the economic pressure on Russia, the sanctions architecture that has hammered Moscow's budget, begins to lift incrementally. That's the shape of the deal on the table. And here's what nobody is telling you. Zelensky, privately, according to senior European officials, knows this is approximately what a final settlement looks like. The problem isn't Kyiv's leadership anymore. The problem is threefold. First, Putin. The Russian president has spent the last year making precisely the kind of slow, grinding territorial gains that his generals use to argue to Washington that time is on Russia's side. Since May 2025 to May 2026, Russia has made a net gain of approximately 1,669 square miles of Ukrainian territory, about the size of Rhode Island. At 143 square miles per month, Putin's calculation is simple. Why accept a frozen conflict deal today when the map keeps shifting in your direction? Every kilometer Russia takes costs enormous blood and ammunition, but it also strengthens Putin's negotiating leverage by approximately 2 to 3% per month. That's not speculation. That's what officials are saying privately. Second, the hardliners. Inside Russia's military establishment, specifically inside the general staff and among figures connected to the security services, there is a faction that believes any deal that doesn't result in Ukraine's full capitulation and NATO's retreat from Eastern Europe is a strategic defeat. These are not marginal figures. They are generals with actual command authority over the forces currently firing Iskander missiles at Dnipro. They are the ones who, even during the 3-day ceasefire, reportedly kept certain security operations running under semantic cover. They are the reason that every time Witkoff walks out of a meeting saying he feels optimistic, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov walks out of a different door and says that peace is no closer, but no further away. Third, here's where we come back to that third player mentioned at the very beginning of this script. The player in the room that nobody in mainstream coverage is discussing clearly enough. It's not a country. It's not a general. It is the economic architecture that has formed around this war. The weapons manufacturers, the drone producers, the private capital flowing into Ukraine's defense industrial base, and, on the other side, the Iranian drone supply chain feeding Russia. Ukraine's F-5 Flamingo cruise missiles, used just 2 weeks ago to strike military-industrial facilities in Cheboksary, over 1,500 kilometers inside Russian territory, did not appear out of nowhere. Those missiles represent years of domestic Ukrainian defense production, partially funded and technically advised by Western partners. Ukraine now has credible, domestically produced, long-range strike capability. That changes the negotiating calculus in ways that a frozen conflict deal must account for. If Ukraine agrees to a ceasefire while retaining those weapons, Russia will never feel truly secure. If Ukraine agrees to disarm as part of a deal, Kyiv will never feel truly sovereign. But here's the catch. The second pivot, and this one flips the entire narrative on its head again. What happened on May 9th and what is happening this week is evidence that both sides have already crossed a threshold, not toward peace necessarily, but toward managed escalation. The pattern is now visible, and it has a shape. Russia launches a massive drone and missile salvo. Ukraine retaliates with precision strikes on occupied territory military infrastructure. Diplomatic signals are exchanged through Witkoff or through back channels. A short pause happens, and then the cycle restarts. Both militaries have essentially learned how to fight this war without destroying each other's will to eventually stop. That is not the same as peace. But it is, and military historians will say this clearly in 20 years, the necessary precondition for peace. Now understand the stakes at the geopolitical level, because the chain reaction from what happens in the next 72 hours is extraordinary. If the current round of Ukrainian strikes, including the blown Russian military site in occupied territory confirmed this morning, provokes a massive Russian retaliation that kills civilians on a scale that derails the current diplomatic momentum, Witkoff's entire framework collapses. Marco Rubio, who told reporters in Rome just weeks ago that U.S. mediation efforts have not led to a fruitful outcome and that efforts have stagnated, will be proven right. The Coalition of the Willing's security framework, the one signed by 35 nations, becomes effectively a ceremonial document. The war continues on full escalatory footing through the summer and likely into 2027. Follow the domino. If this war continues through 2027 at current intensity, Ukrainian and Western analysts project Russian oil revenue losses through continued drone strikes on refineries and export terminals will force Russia to draw down on its National Wealth Fund reserve below the 3 trillion ruble minimum the finance ministry considers its red line. Below that line, Russia cannot fund both its military operations and its domestic subsidy programs. Something breaks internally. What breaks is unpredictable, but options range from a political crisis inside the Kremlin to a sudden and dramatic Russian escalation, including potential pressure on Finland or the Baltic states, designed to force a broader Western response and change the subject from economic pain to existential NATO confrontation. That scenario, if it unfolds, triggers Article 5 discussions, moves NATO forces to forward deployed status across Eastern Europe, and puts the world in a configuration not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Alternatively, here's what a breakthrough looks like from the inside. Witkoff lands in a European capital. Details are being deliberately vague right now, but sources suggest either Vienna or Ankara, with a revised document. Not the 20-point plan, a compressed 6-point emergency framework. Zelensky has already said negotiations in Florida were constructive, a significant word from a leader who previously used words like inadequate and unacceptable about Russian positions. Ukraine's top negotiator Rustem Umerov has already been in Miami for meetings with the U.S. delegation. The language on territory has reportedly shifted from "Ukraine will not cede any territory under its control" to something more ambiguous. The status of contested regions will be subject to further negotiation under international monitoring. That is not the same thing. That is a door quietly being opened. What does that mean on the ground? It means the strikes this morning, the blown ammunition depot, the hit drone control center, the burning fuel facility in occupied Donetsk are not just military operations, they are negotiating leverage. Every confirmed destruction of a Russian military asset in occupied territory raises Kyiv's position at the table by increments. Every city Ukraine keeps from falling strengthens Zelensky's domestic political standing enough to eventually say yes to a deal that his population would otherwise reject as a betrayal. The 3-day ceasefire in May proved that both Putin and Zelensky can be moved by Trump, by economic pressure, by the sheer grinding exhaustion of a war now in its 5th year. Russia has lost an estimated 143 square miles per week in some recent periods. Ukraine has lost towns it can name. Both nations' populations have absorbed 4+ years of death, displacement, and economic devastation. There is a floor below which neither society wants to go. The question is whether the diplomatic architecture can be assembled fast enough to catch both sides before they fall through it. Here is where we are right now, on the morning of May 21st, 2026, with fragments of a Russian military site still smoldering somewhere in occupied Donetsk. The strikes are real. The diplomatic process is real. The economic pressure on Russia is real. Witkoff's shuttle diplomacy, however unorthodox, however mocked by foreign policy professionals, has produced something, a framework that both sides have not fully rejected, and that 35 nations have endorsed. The 3-day ceasefire happened. The prisoner exchange, 1,000 for 1,000, happened. These are facts. But Putin's generals are still firing Iskander-M missiles at Ukrainian cities. Ukraine's drones are still hitting Russian military infrastructure every night. The hardliners on both sides are still reading the military maps and saying, "Hold on, we can get more." And somewhere in that gap, between what the diplomats believe is possible and what the generals believe is achievable, is where the next 24 to 72 hours will be decided. Trump has said he is getting closer and closer every day. Rubio has said efforts have stagnated. Both things can be simultaneously true in a negotiation this complex. But they cannot both remain true for much longer. Because the economic clock on Russia is ticking, those oil production cuts, those refinery strikes, that reserve fund being drained, and the military clock on Ukraine's ability to absorb Russian missile salvos is not infinite either. So here is where we land. The next 72 hours are binary. Either Witkoff delivers the compressed framework to both sides and both capitals signal, even privately, a willingness to accept its core terms, and this war moves toward its first genuine ceasefire with a mechanism to become permanent. Or the strikes this morning in Donetsk trigger a Russian retaliation that kills enough Ukrainian civilians to make Zelensky politically unable to say yes to any deal. The diplomatic window slams shut before summer, and the war enters its most dangerous phase yet. With Ukraine's long-range strike capability growing, Russia's economy bleeding, and no one left in the room with the leverage to stop either side from reaching for something far more catastrophic than a drone. Deal or bombs, breakthrough or collapse, peace built on exhaustion or escalation built on rage. The smoke over occupied Donetsk this morning is the opening sentence of that choice. And the world, right now, at this exact moment, is waiting for the next line.